Welcome back! Tonight's pretty special because I get to do a book review of one of my very favorite books, Kate Morton's The Forgotten Garden. If you're out of the loop and you have no idea who Kate Morton is and you did not watch my Lake House video, sit tight because I'm going to give you the 411. What I love so much about Kate Morton is her ability to craft. Hands down, the woman knows how to write. What I mean by that is she doesn't just give you one story. She tends to give you two stories with a bunch of subplots. What you have is a past storyline, a present storyline, and then they always merge together to sort of solve an overarching mystery. But then within that, there's just so many subplots, and she just weaves them together so intricately that you don't really know where one ends and one begins. And so even though she does have a large cast of characters, even though she does tend to have a number of POV characters, for me at least, I don't mind. It doesn't bother me. I'm not distracted. I don't feel like all these POVs, all these subplots are taking away from the big picture. The big picture of The Forgotten Garden is basically, who is Nell? Who is Nell? I guess I should tell you a little bit about that. In this one, and I guess most as well, it's not just one past, but there's kind of a past, a present, and then something in the middle. And so for this one, the past, which is where Nell kind of comes from, is 1913, and then the present is the 2000s, and in the middle is the 1970s. And so that one is also dealing with Nell, but I'll get into this a little bit more later. I'm going to start with the present because for me, even though we might get a little bit of a preface, a prologue from the past, the mystery doesn't really start until we hit our present protagonist. And in this case, it's a woman named Cass, and she is Nell's granddaughter. And so we open with her at Nell's deathbed, and after Nell dies, she goes to the house, and her grandma's aunts are like, you know, she wasn't actually our sister. And Cassandra's like, excuse me? And then Nell's lawyer friend comes over, and he's like, oh, congratulations on the house that she left you. And she's like, excuse me? Because they live in Australia, but this house is in England. And so she's like, who was my grandmother? The whole mystery is, who was Nell? Where did she come from? Because when she was discovered by her adoptive parents, it was on a dock, like it was in the 1913s. So we don't have all this modern technology to figure out who people are. And she never told her adopted family who she was. She didn't tell them her name. All they had was this suitcase that contained some clothes and a book of fairy tales. Here's a tiny spoiler, is Nell, when she was on the ship over to Australia from England, she lost her memory. So it wasn't just like, oh, I'm not going to tell anybody who I am. She legitimately could not remember her name, could not remember who she was, where she came from, who her parents were. So for the majority of the novel, like, we don't get any clues. Well, that's not true. For the majority of the novel, we honestly do not know who Nell is. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with Cass. She had been very close to her grandmother. Her mother had essentially abandoned her when she was a child, so she grew up with Nell. She just thought it was important to figure out Nell's past because Nell had never mentioned anything to her. So she hops on a plane, goes to England, and starts to unravel this mystery. Oh gosh, I just don't know where to start because I take long enough already. We're just going to jump into the spoilers, alright? Here is the biggest spoiler of all. I'm not even going to sugarcoat. I'm not even going to wait. Oh, I can't. Actually, I can't because I haven't introduced her yet. Oh my gosh, I feel like I totally screwed that up. So what she learns is that Nell was actually named Ivory Walker, and she was from this grand estate on the coast of England. I think it's kind of by Cornwall. I don't know if the place is real or not, but it's called Tregenna. And the estate was Blackhurst Manor. Her mother was named Rose, and she was a Monttrachet, so they were aristocracy, but she had met an American painter named Nathaniel Walker. They had met and married and come to live at Blackhurst. They end up dying in a train crash. I can't really give you any more until we go to the very beginning, so I'm going to have to take you to the early 1900s. And this is where we meet Eliza Makepeace, whom Ivory has always referred to as the authoress because she is the woman who wrote this book of fairy tales. And so the mystery, yes, it is about Ivory, but it's a lot more about Eliza, because we're like, how does Eliza fit into this whole scenario? When we meet Eliza, she is a young girl living on the streets of London. Her parents have both died. She does have a twin brother named Sammy, although he is simple. I don't quite know why. I think he was deprived of oxygen when he was born. This is a detail you think I know because I've read this book like 5 times. I haven't held on to that. But anyways, while he is simple, they still communicate. She still knows how to talk to him. He still knows how to talk to her. They've got it going on. And they live in one room, like most underprivileged children in novels, with a truly horrendous family, the Swindles. The Swindles essentially swindle these two out of as much money as they possibly can. So, you know, they're working themselves to the bone just to give it to people who don't like them very much and aren't going to feed them well. And yeah, anyways, Rose, Nell's mother, is a Monttrachet. And what we learn is that Eliza's mother, Georgiana, is a Monttrachet. And this is kind of one of my favorite parts of the novel. Well, not parts, but like aspects. You're gonna call me crazy. The deal is, Georgiana has a brother named Linus. He is a good deal older than her. He has a club foot, and I guess he's not really his parents' pride and joy. So he's not a really nice kid. Like, he is one of our POV characters. So let me pause for a minute. In the present, we have Cass. We have a little bit of Nell. And actually, I think that's it. In the 1900s, we have a little bit of Ivory. We have a little bit of Nathaniel. We have a little bit of Rose. We have Eliza Makepeace. And we have Linus. And then we have Adeline, who is Rose's mother, Linus's wife. And then in the 1970s, we have Nell. So I think that pretty much covers it. We get some POVs from Linus, and we just learn he's a crappy dude, okay? And even when Georgiana is born, he's not very nice to her. But she eventually wins his heart, and he just sees them as kind of partners in crime. But sorry, you guys are just gonna be like, why do you even like this part? He develops basically incestuous feelings towards her, and we never get any narration from her. We really get no part of her story except a little bit looking in from not the most reliable of characters, but from what I've gathered, she realizes Linus needs help. I also think she may have been wanting to escape the expectations of her family, and so she runs off with someone who's below her stature, and that happens to be Eliza and Sammy's father. Here's a little bit of a spoiler. In his search for Georgiana, or his poupée, which it's French, and I should look up what poupée means. At one point, I did know. I don't know anymore. So in his search for his poupée, he has this the dad, whoever she ran off with, killed, thinking, well, that'll bring her home. But she's like, I'm not going to return home. She has kept herself and her children's secret for like a decade. But she eventually dies from tuberculosis, which leaves them alone. However, she does show Eliza this clay pot she had hidden that had an ancestral brooch. So it's worth a lot of money, and she's like, look, if the bad man ever comes after you, that's when you sell this. You get yourself and your brother out of here. This brooch plays a huge part in the end, so it is worth mentioning. The parents have died. Eventually, Sammy dies as well, because Georgiana doesn't really talk about her past. So it's left up to Eliza, who has a very wild, active imagination, to come up with her own explanations. And, this is the time of Jack the Ripper. And so at one point, and this is kind of what drove Georgiana away, like, it was the final straw, was Linus had cut her. And so Eliza turns this scar into Georgiana's escape, her brush with the Ripper. So she comes up with this story, or this game called the Ripper, in which either she or Sammy plays Georgiana, and then the other one will be the Ripper. And so whoever is Georgiana has to escape from the Ripper. It's a really foggy day, and they go to play the Ripper, and he ends up getting caught underneath, a horse and carriage, and he dies. And this is how Linus finally finds her, because I guess somehow word had gotten back to him, maybe to his man, that someone had died, and hey, look, there's a girl with red hair. So before she can be sent basically to the workhouse, she's brought to Blackhurst. And here is when we meet Rose. And Rose has, her mother, Adeline, in the lake house, we really only had one antagonist. In the Forgotten Garden, we have 3 or 4. There's Linus, obviously, and then there's Adeline, and in my opinion, Rose. I'll get to her in a minute. But yeah, Adeline had been brought in as a lady's maid kind of situation for Georgiana, almost in hopes that she could tone or tame Georgiana. It doesn't work. Obviously, Georgiana runs off, and then, in his distress, Linus marries Adeline. She had come from very poor means, and in her attempt to woo Linus after Georgiana's departure, she's like, well, I just have to take Georgiana's place. I have to shed my old ways and then prove myself worthy of my new station. And so we don't really get much of her before that, but we do realize the woman was a witch with a B afterwards. She doesn't really care. She rules the roost, and that's all that matters. So when she sees Eliza on her doorstep, she's like, and she's just very grateful that her husband's not there, because they have a loveless marriage, so he's always traveling. So she's just like, too much like Georgiana, she's a street urchin, blah, 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 I don't want anything to do with her. But she also raised Rose like she was a delicate flower. And granted, when Rose was younger, she had swallowed a thimble, and there was this big to-do made out of it. She had x-rays done, which is a big deal, because x-rays were super new in the early 1900s. So just, Rose was raised to think like, oh, I'm dying. Essentially, that she's dying. And so she just has to be treated with kid gloves. Even on top of that, this is how you're supposed to live. These are the rules and regulations of our society. Then she tasks Rose with the re-education of Eliza Makepeace. And Eliza's like, no. I love Eliza. I think she's fantastic. I mean, she is such a strong female character, especially during a time where she's not allowed to be strong. Rose initially thinks that Eliza is this, feral child, but eventually Eliza wins Rose over. They become best friends. She gets Rose out of her shell. She kind of nurses her back to health in a way, because if you've ever seen The Secret Garden, which is a good tie-in, because part of this novel, Kate actually alludes to the fact that this maze that leads to the Forgotten Garden is where Frances Hodgson Burnett got her idea for The Secret Garden. So yes, if you've ever read The Secret Garden, you know that the cousin thought he was dying, and so he stayed inside all the time. He never opened his windows. That was Rose. Eliza injects life into Rose's life in more ways than one. They become extremely close, much to Adeline's horror. Eventually, Linus does come home, and he basically starts stalking Eliza too, and Eliza's like, dude's a creeper. So she stays away from him as much as possible. And what she ends up doing is, when Georgiana had been around, she had loved the maze, all right? So there's a maze, and it ends at a cliff cottage. And so when Eliza comes to Blackhurst, she, like with Rose, injects life back into the maze, and then eventually she does move into Cliff Cottage, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Remember when I told you that Rose had the x-rays? What they did not realize, it could fry your eggs. You know, when you go to the dentist and they take the x-rays of your teeth, they put the thing over you? Yeah, didn't know that in the early 1900s. And so they did like a 1-hour exposure, which is super deadly. Rose, as much as she outgrows her mother's expectations for her, she still has the typical of the day expectations and desires for her life, which Eliza never has. But Rose wants to get married. And so when they're 16 or so, Adeline's like, look, Eliza, I'm taking Rose on a trip, okay? And you're not allowed, but you've got to let Rose think it was your decision. So on this trip to the continent, I think that's what it was. Is Europe the continent or is America? I should know this. Anyways, she meets Nathaniel, and that's kind of the beginning of the end. Because it's not that Nathaniel was bad, but for me, this is when Rose's true colors come out. And so when I did my pro-con list, I was like, Rose is a con, but in the best way. Because at first, you really kind of like her. Like, you feel bad for her because, hello, look what kind of mom she has. And then her dad could care less about her. She's a shut-in. She has no friends, no life. And then there comes Eliza. And so you're like, all right, Rose, you're really not as bad as your mom. But then she meets Nathaniel, and her whole life is focused on marriage and on family. So this is something I don't quite understand, all right? And this is like a true con for me that never bothered me before. She comes home from this trip, and if she and Eliza are such good friends, are so close, why does she not immediately go to Eliza when she comes home? Like, why does she let her mother, who she knows doesn't like Eliza, and is going to do everything she can to tear them apart, why does she let her mom talk her out of going to see Eliza? I get the reasoning, but at the same time, that's when I just don't really understand Rose, and that's when she becomes more of a villain. Because you should really see her self-centeredness. You see her insecurities. She and Nathaniel come home, and they try to have a family, and it just doesn't work. They know nothing about what this x-ray machine has done to her. All they know is that she can't get pregnant. And so here is the biggest spoiler of all. If you haven't guessed it already, if you haven't connected all the dots, I'm going to connect them for you. I'm just going to draw a line, all right? There's no. They approach Eliza. You know, Eliza and Nathaniel do what needs to be done. She gets pregnant. So she is actually Ivory/Nell's birth mother. But, you know, if you thought the rift between Rose and Eliza was bad before, once she has, actually before she even has Ivory, Adeline has the door that connects Cliff Cottage to the maze taken out and sealed up, and then she has a huge wall built around the cottage, which is like, how do you see your view? But, you know, it's the whole idea of she can't be pregnant if she's not married, and nobody wants anybody to know that Ivory is not Rose's child. So the gap between them grows, and, you know, once Ivory is born, part of the deal is, like, Eliza can't have anything to do with her anymore. She's not allowed to visit the house. Not like she came to the house very often, but now she's all alone by herself at the cottage. Nobody will come see her. Nathaniel, like, it only was like a 2-week process. Maybe it's only a 1-week process. In any case, even before all this started, she had been a writer. You know, she had been writing down stories, fairy tales, and he, as an artist, he decided, you know what, I'm going to illustrate these stories. So as he would come to visit her, they would bond over this, and they would bond over all kinds of things. So he's not even allowed to come see her anymore, so her one friend, like, you get the sense, because Rose is so obsessed with having a child, with having this family. You get the sense that he's over it. And then he actually falls in love with Eliza, who, in my opinion, I've already told you, I love Eliza. I think she's fantastic. She's the cooler of the two chicks. Like, she's the one that you think should get the guy. She doesn't. But when Eliza does actually get her stories and these illustrations published into a book, she brings it down to the house because she's like, I want Ivory to see them. But this has broken the rules. And so here's where we're getting into, some more of the meat that I couldn't get into before because you had no context. Rose is essentially like afraid of Eliza. She's afraid that Eliza will come back, that Eliza will threaten their happiness. And so she decides, with Adeline's help, that she, Nathaniel, and Ivory need to move to America. Because that's where Nathaniel's from. This is all in the works when Nathaniel and Rose die. Eliza had already been planning to leave. She had already been planning on traveling. So she's in town, and one of her friends is like, so we're really sorry. And she just thinks, oh yeah, they're leaving. It's like, no, they died. She returns back to her cottage, and this is all just massive spoilers, guys. Massive spoilers. She returns to the cottage and she finds Ivory there because there had been a couple times where Nathaniel had come to visit her and Ivory had followed. So Ivory, not knowing her parents had died, had come to the cottage, and Eliza's like, you know what? I'm not leaving you with your grandparents. You're going to come with me, and they were going to go to Australia. And so here's kind of the biggest spoiler of them all, because after we learn who Ivory is, or even before we learn who Nell Ivory is, like, the question is, what happened to Eliza? Like, what happened to any kind of parental figure? How did Nell/Ivory end up alone on this boat? And the answer to that is, Adeline at some point was alerted to Ivory's absence. She goes to Cliff Cottage, and she's like, well, I'm really glad that Eliza's gone, because I've wanted her out of my hair for a really long time, but maybe she took the kid. And so she sees, because, we all have a fatal flaw in our plans, and she sees a list, a to-do list that Eliza had left on the table, and she had written Swindle. So Adeline's like, I think I recognize that name. She sends Linus's man to go collect Eliza. And what Eliza had been meaning to do was to, can you guess? Have you figured it out? She wanted to get that clay pot with the brooch in it. Because after Sammy had died and the man had, I think it's Mr. Mansell, when he had come and taken her to Blackhurst, she had forgotten to grab it. And so she's like, I cannot leave without this. Like, not only can it get me money, but it's also a part of my mother. Like, I can't just leave it in this chimney. She's caught, and Mr. Mansell is taking her back to Blackhurst, and she throws herself out of the carriage, and she dies. Kind of similar to Sammy. And she'd already dropped Nell/Ivory off on the ship. That's why Ivory ends up alone, and that's what happens to Eliza. And while we are in the 1970s timeline with grown-up Nell, what she had done was, after her dad's death, she got that suitcase that she had arrived with, and I don't quite remember, I think maybe she was just doing some sleuthing of her own. She ended up in Cornwall, and she discovered her parentage. So while she was there, she was like, I want to buy Cliff Cottage. So that's how she ended up with it. And her intention had actually been to go and to leave Australia and to live in England, but she was packing. She was about to move when Cass showed up at her door and kind of screwed up all her plans. I still don't know why she never said anything to Cass about this house or about her parentage. Maybe it's the age, like my grandfather never told us about his family. So maybe that was it. Maybe it just wasn't something that she wanted to deal with. I don't really know. All the pieces come together. We find out who Nell is. We discover the mystery behind Eliza Makepeace. Aside from the crafting, what I especially enjoyed about The Forgotten Garden were the fairy tales. Because it is hard enough to write a book. So I can't imagine how much harder it is to write a book within a book and make it plausible. Make it something that the reader, is like, all right, this needs to be here. This enhances the story. I mean, have you ever written a fairy tale? It's really hard, folks. Like, I tried, and there's a magic to it, but also kind of has to have some kind of morality tale to it. Like, it's not just talking about princes and princesses and dwarves and whatever fairy dust. Like, there has to be an underlying meaning. So what Kate Morton did is she wove Eliza's life into these fairy tales, but made it magical. There is one story called The Golden Egg. It's about this princess who was dying, and the only way to save her was this golden egg. And so the queen was like, I need that golden egg. So she sends her emissary to this woman in a shack in the woods, who is the keeper of this egg. And she's like, you need to give it to me. And, the keeper is like, I can't. It's my inheritance. I am meant to guard this egg. And in the end, she is convinced to give the egg for the good of the kingdom. And then the keeper basically, yes, dies, but she kind of she sees no more purpose in life. So she just kind of gives up. And so that reflects Eliza's life, where this egg is the child, where for Rose's health, for her sanity, this is what she needs. Eliza is convinced to have a child for her, and at first she's like, yeah, it's fine. But any mother will tell you, you attach to the child in your womb, and she eventually found it really difficult to give up this child, and eventually, she knew that's what she had to do. That was the right thing to do, but in giving up Ivory, she gave up a very precious part of her. And it kind of, not just giving up the child, but in giving the child to Rose, it severed their relationship. So what did she have to live for anymore? So let's get into that. So as much as I loved Eliza, I didn't quite understand her after she came to Blackhurst and Cliff Cottage, because we didn't get so much of her at that point. We got a lot of her when she was younger, when she was in London, when she and Sammy were together, and right around until Sammy died and she was taken away. And maybe this is to create a mystique around her, because that's kind of how she's known in the village. She's just eccentric. And, on one hand, I'm fine with that. But, so Sammy was her world, and then Sammy died. Then Rose becomes her world, yet, because we don't get anything from her point of view, it's almost like she's okay with giving up Rose once Rose meets Nathaniel. And then Rose treats her like crap. It's very passive-aggressive. She doesn't just, sever ties, but she kind of drifts away slowly. There's always an excuse why she can't see Eliza, and Eliza always buys it and always excuses it for her until, eventually they really don't have anything to do with each other. So then she jumps at this chance to have a child for Rose, and I guess at first, because she doesn't have any strong familial ties. She's never been a very maternal person. Her goal was never to get married and have all of that. So I guess she did see it as what she could do for her best friend. But I just was like, how do you really feel, Eliza? What's going through your head from the point where Rose goes off and then comes back engaged to a guy, to the point where she takes your kid? I mean, eventually we do get this understanding that she realized it wasn't the right thing to do. That was her child. As much as she doesn't regret her decision in giving Ivory away, Ivory was hers. So in a way she's kind of torn where her loyalties lie. Just like the girl in the fairy tale who knew that this was her birthright to guard this egg, but for the good of the kingdom, she should give it up. So it's for the good of the kingdom, she should guard it, but also for the good of the kingdom, she needs to give it up. I didn't really understand her motivations from a certain point on, and I wish that I could have gotten more into her head, because she just dropped off the map, really, and everything we saw about her was from Rose or Nathaniel or Adeline, or even during Nell's storyline when she was talking to people from the village who had ties to Blackhurst or maybe were around at that point. So we get glimpses of Eliza through them, but for someone who is so strong-willed, I thought it was just really strange that Eliza would just accept her ostracism, her banishment. I would want to get away from my creepy uncle and my witch of an aunt as well. So, like, her moving out of Blackhurst, I get, especially because she recognized with Nathaniel there, she was never going to have the same relationship with Rose as she once had. But I could not give up my best friend that easily. I mean, I've had a best friend who to this day, I don't know what happened, but she just cut me off. Like, she stopped talking to me. And that hurt turned to anger. Now, it's just how it is, and I wish we could still be friends, but it probably will never happen again. I'm like, so Eliza, there was no animosity there whatsoever? You just kind of, like, hung out by yourself for 10 years or however long it took between Rose getting married and then having Ivory? I just, it bothered me that I'm just supposed to assume that Eliza was okay with the way she was treated. I don't know. I mean, you read it, you tell me what you think. Let's continue a little bit more with Rose. I really could have done without her as a point of view character. As I mentioned with the lake house, the main mystery is about what happened to this toddler, this missing child. And he was like 1 year old, and we had a couple perspective scenes from him, and I was fine with it. But in this one, I don't think she was completely necessary. We do see her growing into a more selfish, self-centered person, but I feel like we could have also seen that from afar. I didn't quite need to see it coming from her, especially because when it came down to having Eliza get pregnant for her, it was alluded to, but it was more coming from Adeline than from Rose. Maybe if Rose had been the one to come up with it, or had more of a hand in it, then I would have been like, alright, I'm okay with having all of these Rose perspectives. Give her perspective chapters to Eliza. Let's see and feel the pain from Eliza, the girl who had lost her entire family, only to kind of find her family in another person, and then that other person just drop her. I think it would have been more effective. It would have been more emotional, and I would have gotten my Eliza chapters. Rose, I love to hate her. I hated that she became a villain of sorts, but it's for the good of the novel, if you will. With Rose, I wanted less of her. I wanted more of Nathaniel, because he's just kind of funny, because as Americans, we just have, in a way, we have this really black and white way of looking at things, and he's just like, what am I doing here? Because he wasn't a very successful artist, and in order to not look like a fool, Adeline promoted him. And so his forte was more of a sketch kind of deal, but in England, it was all about portraiture. She got him in with her set, and so he became a portraiture, or, he painted people's portraits. And he's just like, I don't enjoy what I'm doing. I don't like my in-laws. My wife is kind of crazy. I just thought he was great, especially in context of him with Eliza. I thought they had so much chemistry. I really would have liked to have gotten a clearer picture on what his feelings were. Would he really have chosen Eliza over Rose? What did he think of the whole situation of having to sleep with his wife's best friend / cousin in order to have a kid? In the end, would he have left Rose for Eliza if they had died? But c'est la vie. The last of my issues, which my issues really, guys, are minor in the grand scheme of things, this is just my 5th or 6th read through, and I'm finally seeing things that I'm like, I don't know, you know, like, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. But yes, my last issue revolves around Nell's reaction when she found out she was adopted. Now, this could just be my lack of understanding of how that feels, because she was 21 before her dad sprung that news. And it was on her 21st birthday, like at the celebration of her 21st birthday. So it really wasn't the best timing, but she really had this great upward trajectory of life. She was engaged, she had a really great relationship with her family, and upon being told that she was adopted, she dropped it all. She dropped her family, she dropped her fiance, she headed off on her own, she completely severed ties. And I guess it was because she felt betrayed, and she lost a sense of who she was. But I couldn't quite get behind it. Like, if you love a guy, why leave him? I guess she got married later because she obviously had a daughter who then had Cass. But we don't really get much into that relationship. So I don't know how she felt about him. I don't know if maybe the first guy was the wrong guy for her. But I was just like, is that really how a person would react? I'm sure there's a moment, like, you're stunned, and then you go through those stages of grief. But do you really abandon your entire life because of a revelation? Would it have been worse if she'd never known at all? And if she'd never known at all, nobody would have ever known. You know? Because I don't think the sisters knew until that point. So, like, anyways, yeah, and maybe it's also because I like happy endings. So I hate that she gave up this really great life because something rocked her world. Please, chime in on this. Tell me, how would you feel if you are adopted? When did you find out? Because I've watched a show, Long Lost Family, where, yes, they don't find out till they're in their 20s or their 30s or their teens or whatever, and it just, like, it shakes their foundation. I understand that, but I don't understand giving everything up because of it. So yeah, please chime in, tell me really how that works, okay? In summary, I gotta say, an amazing audiobook. They're all amazing, amazing audiobooks. The narrator is fantastic. This was an amazing book. It remains one of my favorites. As I've said, read it 5 or 6 times. I have it on audiobook. I have it as an ebook. I have it as a physical copy. I would love to see it as a movie. I would buy it as a movie. Anything I can get. Pick it up. She has quite a few. My favorites are Forgotten Garden, The Lake House. Let's see. I would probably go with The Clockmaker's Daughter, and then The Secret Keeper, House at Riverton, and then The Distant Hours. Not that The Distant Hours is bad. It's just the bittersweet was a little bit too bitter for me. I needed, as much as I don't like sap, I needed a little bit more sweet. So, yeah, that's my order of her books, and I would love to know yours. So, there we go. Bye.